to be most successful, organizations should not look to hire people to fill positions. Instead, positions should be created to capitalize on people. Organizations should go looking for people who can bring unique added value into them. A number of years ago, I was looking for a creative marketing person. However, I didn't write a typical advertisement listing the credentials and experience of the person I was looking for. Instead, I said that I wanted someone who was creative, energetic, imaginative, and tireless. If I wanted to attract people who were different, I knew that I would have to advertise to them a bit differently. When the first person called in response to the ad, I told my secretary that the interviews for the position would be held the next day at 6 a.m. It seemed to me natural that if I wanted someone who was tireless, 6 a.m. would not be a problem. Well, 12 people responded to the ad. Several said that they had never been up that early, so clearly we knew that we didn't want them. Of the 6 who said they were still interested in the job, 3 actually showed up. And out of those 3, I hired exactly the kind of go-getter, energetic, creative, and tireless person I wanted. The third timeless principle is that, like any person, an organization cannot move in more than one direction at the same time. Yet, too often, businesses and organizations think that they can actually pursue major, even contrary strategies at the same time. All that does is drain resources and confuse the system. It leads to inaction. Fourth, like the internal organs of a human being, all of the parts of an organization must be in harmony. Too often, people in organizations do not take into account the effect of their environment on the people within it. The fifth timeless principle is that, like living things, organizations are dynamic. They develop through phases. When they are young, they need one kind of organization and certain kinds of resources. When they grow up, they need different ones. Like living things, organizations may become exhausted and even fall apart in one form. An organization has to know how to keep itself alive by changing as the internal and external factors affecting it change. And it can't change begrudgingly. It must embrace change. Change is life. The sixth timeless principle is that, like any mature individual, a successful organization must ultimately be able to stand on its own 2 feet. It cannot remain dependent upon anyone or anything for its survival. Think of it as the natural law of survival of the fittest. Globalization, which appears to be so desirable for so many organizations, can actually bring with it interdependence that can weaken organizations. Since the early 1970s, when the first oil crises hit the industrialized world, little or nothing has been done to develop alternative energy sources. So, the world's most economically advanced countries continue to rely upon fossil fuels. As a result, their economies are dependent upon the whims of the oil-producing nations. That puts their national destinies at risk. As part of its independence, an organization must be structured to guarantee its survival at all costs. The seventh timeless principle is that an organization must be creative. Every living thing in nature must procreate or die out. Organizations must be able to create and recreate themselves. An organization must continually be able to generate new ideas and strategies to keep itself alive. It isn't just a matter of having a research and development department which is exclusively responsible for generating next generation products and services. Every part of the organization must continually be regenerating itself. Eighth, an organization must never grow too big. The larger a natural organism grows, the more unwieldy it becomes. What it gains in size, it loses in flexibility. Moreover, it invites competition against it from smaller, more nimble organisms. The history of businesses and organizations is filled with examples of entities that began as lean and mean companies, but that grew to be awkward and cumbersome. Giant Microsoft began as a spirited, tiny company, but has developed into a lumbering corporate behemoth. Confident, overconfident, that its monopoly in operating systems would guarantee its future and the dominance of the PC, it ignored the Internet. On its own, it has attempted to break itself down into smaller, more manageable parts. But its size has made it a target and has slowed it down in the marketplace. 9. In nature, the parties to a marriage must be compatible if they are going to survive and thrive long term. The same is true of the merger of two or more organizations. Corporate mergers are much more than legal affairs. The recent merger of Germany's Daimler-Benz and Chrysler in the United States has been a disaster. But its failure could have been predicted from the start. The two companies literally did not speak the same language. Their corporate cultures were entirely different. They had little or nothing in common, except that they both produced cars. and that wasn't enough. Their corporate merger resembled a marriage in which a husband and wife did not speak the same language or understand each other's culture. Of course, some people would say jokingly that that could be the basis for a perfect marriage. But in reality, that can last only so long. Globalization makes it seem as though organizations can merge or acquire each other like pieces on a chessboard, and on a massive scale, as though no accommodation has to be made for there being living organizations, organizations of people whose complexities and nuances must be taken into account. That is a potentially fatal mistake. Number 10, in nature, there is no such thing as perfection, only workability. Not every seed that is planted grows into a viable plant. Not every fertilized egg grows into a viable human being. Some smart people may not be athletic. An athletic person may not be smart. Nothing and no one has it all. Roses are beautiful, but have no smell. Night-blooming jasmine has a sensuous fragrance, but looks like a weed. One animal may be slow, but compensates for it by being able to paralyze any attacker from a distance with a barb. Individuals and organizations do not need to drive themselves crazy striving for perfection, because it doesn't exist. They must maintain the highest standards of product and service delivery, but they need to accept imperfection, even failure, as part of the natural order of things. Let's go through an exercise for a few minutes that will recap what I've shared with you and give you a chance to rate yourself and your organization in terms of the following timeless principles of management. Grade yourself 1 to 5, 5 being the best, on how well you carry each one out. There are 10 of them, so the closer you get to 50, the better. 1. How willing are you to adapt single models to different and changing circumstances, as opposed to trying to find one model that fits every situation? 2. How consistently do you develop your organization around the strengths of individuals, as opposed to just hiring people who have qualifications to do jobs? 3. How often does your organization go off in too many directions, thereby possibly stretching or depleting its resources? 4. Is your organization in harmony, or are there unproductive internal struggles? 5. Is your organization dynamic? Are you able to change? 6. Is your organization truly independent, or is it weakened by its alliances? 7, do you reward creativity everywhere? 8, have you stayed small enough so you can react quickly to opportunities? 9, when you merge elements into your corporate culture, can you make a meaningful marriage or partnership out of it? And 10, do you opt for workable solutions rather than unrealistic expectations? Take a minute and add up your total. Remember, 50 is maximum. How well did you do? Are you surprised? Now, let's take some time to talk about these 10 timeless management principles. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about how they relate to your own experiences within organizations, and whether you feel that in order to be most successful, organizational principles must be grounded in the underlying laws and behaviors of nature and human nature.
Thank you, Stephen. Now let's begin with the first question and answer session for today. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call, and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or which appear on your screen. Remind you to make your phone calls at a distance from the monitor to help avoid feedback. And our first question today comes to us from the Universidad Tecnológico de Tecamac in Mexico. And if we may have that question, please.
Congratulations and greetings from the Technological University of Tecamac in Mexico. I have the following question. It seems incredible that if these are basic truths or eternal truths or universal truths, why have they been neglected by the .com organizations? Did anybody tell them about that, or did people in those companies or organizations ever take, I guess they never took this video conference program?
Wow, I'm sorry, but thank you. I think that's a great question, and I'm going to let you dive right in. I probably could come up with a couple things.
Well, be sure you do as well. This doesn't have to be just my show. But the thing is, and what you've addressed is the perhaps most important question of all, and that is, why do people ignore things that are obvious, even true, even commonsensical? Think of yourself. How many times a day, or perhaps a week, have you said to yourself, I can't believe that the person doing this silly or unproductive or even stupid thing didn't see what was obvious? Now, we say this all the time, but there are many reasons that are complex, related to given situations. Part of the thing is that in the investment arena, to specifically address the matter of the .coms, the investment arena, the exchange of securities, is a speculative market, which is driven by a frenzy. There was, in the mid-19th century in the United States, the gold rush in California, and people came from everywhere looking to strike it rich. There is a very well-known case in Holland with tulips and the speculative frenzy over tulips, where people paid vast amounts of money for bulbs that would grow into tulips. People will do everything from insane or crazy things to downright silly things. But then in other arenas, there are what we would call political realities. And think again how often in certain governmental or organizational situations, everybody knows what the truth is. Everybody knows what should be done, but because of conflicting interests, the right thing is not done. What I try to say to people is, let's keep looking at what we know is true and fundamental.
It seems to me that that question was particularly apropos to some of your introductory comments about the timelessness of these issues, and you must apply them from here forward. And perhaps some of the .com folks are young people and they don't understand the timeless nature. Let's go to our question now from the Federación Nacional de Comerciantes in Medellín, Colombia.
Buenos días. Our question is the following. It is clear that the importance of the human talent in every organization. Now, how can you detect it if the people who work with them, their peers, always experiment psychological successes? So how can they actually apply these other fundamental truths?
I'm not sure what psychological success means, but if I think I'm interpreting it correctly, it is that the baseline for the way organizations need to work has to be the individual. And that, in other words, instead of looking at the organization as though it exists outside of people, we need to keep coming back to individuals and individuals working with other individuals. It is very difficult to change the culture or the way in which any organization or business works. That is an extremely difficult thing to do. If you have somebody at the top of an organization, and in most situations that is the case, and that person is acting autocratically, or if that person isn't sensitive to certain kinds of things, you have a very difficult go of it. And the thing that I would say is that rather sometimes than try to change the organization, what people sometimes need to do is to leave the organization for a more compatible one, or create their own organization. But if you're going to stay within an organization which may not be attuned to some of the more timeless ways of doing things, the best way to do it is to begin to find people of like mind, so that you now begin to get a consensus, and that consensus builds. Many people try to change people who are diametrically opposed to them. Those are the ones they go for first. They find somebody who thinks differently, and they right away say, oh, I've got to convince that person. What you need to do is to get somebody who's a little bit like you, and another person is a little bit like you, and another one, and before you know it, you've got more votes, and you can change the culture.
It sounds to me like that's a little bit of that organic change you talked about. Put it into the fabric of the organization.
Exactly.
We have a question from the Centro Universitario de Tijuana in Baja California. Your question, please.
Buenos días.
In globalized economies like the current marketplaces, what is the point of equilibrium in order to incorporate human resources with an acceptable performance?
Well, the global focus of organizations creates two potentially conflicting situations. The first is that people think that one size can fit all, that at a certain level somebody can perhaps put a website on the internet, and that it will somehow reach and convince and do business with everybody. I talk about that in the next segment. But the important thing, I believe, globally, is to recognize that people are people everywhere, and that there is a common thread, even for all of the obvious cultural and ethnic differences, that those are the artificial things that separate us. That whether people have festivals at certain times of the year, or whether they think one way or another way, whether the relationship between families or men and women and hours of business opening or closing, all of the things that apparently make us different disguise the fact that we are all the same. Science is showing us increasingly that, like it or not, we are all the same. I mean, for all of our apparent differences, even the unraveling of our genetic code has shocked people by really how few genes there are on our DNA, not how many. We are far more simple than people realize. The important thing to realize is in some ways to use yourself as a baseline and to say, okay, am I doing or thinking something that makes no sense to me, and that deep down in my gut, in my solar plexus, I know doesn't make any sense? And do I honestly think that somebody else, halfway around the world or in the office next door to me, doesn't see the truth of the situation either? That's kind of the litmus test.
Okay, good. Let's take a question now from the Dominican Republic and the Universidad Católica. And the question, please. Okay. Are we there with the question?
No question. Any pregunta?
Okay.
Adelante.
We're going to take a question now from Univa.
Bueno,
Oh, here we go.
bueno,
Bueno.
bueno, buenos días. Soy Jesús Gallegos,
I am Jesus Gallegos
de CECAP,
from
de la Gerencia de
CECAP,
Capacitación de
from
Comisión Federal
Mexico,
de México, Distrito Federal.
Federal District of Mexico.
La instrucción
The
corresponde a la
instruction
ciencia.
corresponds to
La sabiduría
science,
corresponde a la
and wisdom
conciencia.
corresponds to consciousness.
Procuremos instruirnos
Let's try
lo suficiente,
to learn
buscando la
ourselves,
sabiduría
looking
que la
and
ciencia
looking
sea
for wisdom.
nuestra escalinata
And we need to expect science to be our ladder, our stairway up, instead of our trap. We need to see that in finding this balance that's the only way you become wise, by finding yourself, and then you will find success. Mr. Speakers, thank you for your wonderful presentation, and here comes my question now. With these principles, the organization —
para la organización en una empresa que la rige, ¿qué principios debe seguir? 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 ¿Qué la ciencia
is
o la
guided by
sabiduría.
science or by wisdom? That's the question. Is an organization guided by science? Should it be guided or driven by science or by wisdom?